Explorers paddled deep.
Yeah, imagine you back in 1801, you deep in Amazon, all of a sudden you come face to face with a large snake. That's what happened back in 1801 in Amazon. But let's get to the video, shall we?
Into the Amazon, a lake few dared to name. They carried maps and powder, but found prints too wide for any beast, and carcasses crushed as if by coils. Warning spoke of a water mother that stirred when the trees bent back from the shore. Still, they pressed on. What rose from those depths left only silence, scars, and a terror no map could hold. So, before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. We set off from the mouth of a narrow tributary at first light, with the heavy air pressing against our faces and the damp of the night still trapped under the tarps. Our two canoes rode low from sacks of farina, salt pork, a chest of powder and shot, a small chest of glass vials, and the roll of charts that Captain Duarte guarded under oilcloth. I kept the journal and tended the samples. Father Celestino carried a wooden cross and a worn satchel of herbs. Ramos, a soldier on loan from the garrison at Barcelos, sat aft with a musket across his knees and a bored look he did not try to hide. Irapua, our guide, stood in the bow with a paddle in hand, and his young cousin Davi near his hip, quiet and watchful. The purpose was simple on paper. We would track a chain of dark water streams to a remote lake that traders mentioned in half-finished sentences, take bearings, collect plants, mark the course, and return before the flood rose too high for safe landings. That was how the captain told it to the governor, and that was how he told it to us. The stream was narrow enough that branches leaned over us. The water ran black and slow, with a stale taste where leaves rotted in mats under the surface. Fish rose without sound and dimpled the skin of the water, then vanished. Damp crept into everything. After an hour, the sun could not pierce the canopy with any strength, and the heat sat still without relief. We moved by the steady rhythm of paddles tapping the surface and lifting again. No speech for long stretches, only the slide of hulls and a soft knocking when a hidden root caught us. By midday we came to a spit where the current turned and a clay bank held the prints of something heavy that had pulled itself out and back again. The marks were wide and smooth, with no claws, and the reeds were dragged flat. I thought of a river cow at first, and then dismissed it. The distance between the sweeps was longer than any I had seen. Duarte peered at the mud and shrugged. Everything grows well here, he said, even the tails. He did not like delays. He checked the sun, then called us back to the canoes. We passed the carcass of a capybara near the next bend. It lay wedged in a tangle with its ribs showing through dark hide. There were no bite marks along the edges. The body looked crushed in the middle, as if wrapped by bands. I took the length of it with my eye and said nothing. Ramos prodded it with the butt of his musket, and the whole mass shifted and slipped beneath the tangle. Davi stepped back on the thwart without a word. I felt a sour taste in my mouth that came from more than the heat. In the afternoon, we met a pair of traders with a hollowed trunk boat hauled onto a sandbar. They had a small heap of gourds and baskets of dried fish, and their eyes moved between us and the bank without resting. They asked where we were going. Irapua told them the name of the creek and the lake beyond. They did not repeat the word. The older man spat and said the mouth of that lake was where the water mother slept and woke. He said the trees there leaned back from the shore. He held his hands apart and moved them in a slow circle, and I did not mistake his meaning. Duarte offered tobacco, thanked them, and pushed us off. When we were out of earshot, he told me to note in the journal that 2 men in a trunk boat attempted to frighten us for gain. I wrote only that we met them and exchanged tobacco. Toward evening, a thin film spread across the surface where a side stream joined ours. It shone with a faint, iridescent sheen that smelled of musk. The canoe glided through it, and the film parted and closed again. Flies rose in bursts and settled. Father Celestino damped a cloth and tied it over his mouth and nose. He pressed the cross to his chest with one hand and kept the other steady on the gunwale. The water holds what it must, he said. He had a habit of speaking to no one in particular when discomfort grew. Ramos called ahead and asked if the smell came from a plant. Irapua did not answer. He nudged the bow toward the middle where the black ran clearest. We camped on a raised patch where the ground held firmer than the mud around it. We cut palm for a lean-to, set the fire in a ring of stones, and hung hammocks from 3 trunks. The fire smoked for a long time and would not take a strong flame. Mosquitoes sank into any patch of skin not painted with rancid grease. The meal was hard bread and salted meat softened in a pot. Davy ate without lifting his eyes. When the food was done, I cleaned the vials and repacked them while the captain checked his charts again by firelight. He measured with calloused fingers and set marks with a stub of charcoal that left dust on his knuckles. I watched his hands and thought that he trusted numbers and lines more than any living thing in that place. In the night, something bumped the hull twice, a soft thud, and then a longer scrape that traveled from bow to stern with slow pressure. I lay awake and counted my breaths. The scrape did not repeat. Somewhere out in the dark, a branch cracked. Water lapped on the far side of the spit where we had pulled the canoes up and tied them. I kept my back to the fire and tried not to imagine the line settling loose. In the morning, the knots held tight, but the sand around the bows showed a shallow furrow as if something had pressed against them and shifted them inch by inch. I told myself the tide had lifted and dropped. The sun had not yet cleared the canopy when we pushed off again. The banks changed after that. The trees drew back and left a collar of bare mud where no saplings took root. The water deepened under the surface without showing a change in color, and the paddle blades did not find bottom where they had before. There were no birds for a stretch that felt too long for chance. Every sound we made came back thin. I looked to the others and saw them avoiding each other's eyes. It was not fear yet. It was the sense that our noise did not belong in that space. By midday, we saw the mouth of the lake. The stream opened into still water that spread to a line of drowned trunks and floating logs. The surface held a pale scum near the shore and clear black in the middle. 2 poles stood at the mouth, each wrapped with woven grass and marked with shallow cuts. Feathers hung from them. The bindings were new. Davy touched the edge of one feather and drew back his hand. "We should not cross," he said. I had not heard him speak a full sentence until then. I looked to the guide. Irapua stood with his jaw set and his eyes on the center of the lake. He did not answer his cousin, which told me enough. Duarte kept his voice even. "We will skirt the margin. We mark the extent. We do not linger." He did not look at the poles. He did not ask what they meant. He was tired of warnings. Father Celestino lifted his cross and made a sign over the water. He said a short prayer for safe passage and for restraint. Ramos checked the priming on his musket and grinned without humor. "If it is a fish, it will taste the same as any other," he said. I saw his hands shake when he set the weapon across his thighs. We moved along the fringe where the scum swirled in slow loops around the paddles. Bubbles rose in clusters and broke. The smell of musk came again, stronger than before. I counted the time between the clusters. There was no order to it. A large log turned by itself with no wind to move it. Our canoe drifted away from the other for a moment, and I pulled us back with 2 short strokes. I did not feel a current, yet we slipped sidewise between strokes, and the hairs at the back of my neck lifted in a way I could not dismiss. Near a tongue of reeds, Devi pointed at something pale under the surface. It was a strip of tissue, long and narrow, caught on a sunken branch. It undulated without the aid of current, and then stilled. When we brought the canoe close, it came free and rose, and I caught it with the edge of my paddle and lifted it toward the bow. It was the outer layer of a shedskin, translucent and thick, with the pattern of scale edges pressed into it. The width of it made my mouth dry. I laid it along the thwart without speaking. The captain looked at it and did not ask me to pack it. He told me to note the find later. He did not meet my eyes. We heard a sound then that was not like the crack of branches or the push of a fish. It was the slow expulsion of air through a wet passage, and then silence, and then the sound again farther off. It came from under the surface, not above it. We froze without instruction. The water around the bow showed a series of rings that spread and touched the reeds and then vanished. I felt a cold line in my stomach that had nothing to do with the heat of the day. I waited for a third breath. It did not come. We reached a small rise at the edge of the lake where roots gripped the mud and gave us a place to step out. We made a noon fire to boil water and keep the mosquitoes off our faces. The fire caught better here. I took the skin to the shade and measured its width with a strip of cloth I kept for that purpose, marked it, and rolled it with care. I did not look toward the center of the lake again while I worked. Behind me, the others spoke in low voices. I heard Davi argue with the guide in his own tongue and then fall quiet. Ramos boasted that he would put a ball through any beast that showed itself. He spoke to fill the air and his words felt thin. I did not correct him. I watched the lines on the cloth and tried to think only of numbers. When we pushed off to continue the circuit, the water darkened ahead in a moving patch. It was not the shadow of a cloud. The sky above us held no cloud. The patch passed and we sat still and watched it slide under, slow and steady, without bubbles or fins. The canoes rocked in its wake with a motion that did not match the size of the disturbance. No one spoke. I did not raise my paddle. I felt the movement under us as a pressure in my bones more than a motion of the hull. I told myself then that we could still turn back. I looked at the poles at the mouth of the lake and at the straight line of trees beyond. I thought of the distance already covered and the river rising later in the season, and of the reports we had promised to deliver. Then the patch of dark water curved, and the reeds on the far side bent and slowly righted, and a wide V appeared in the scum and held there, pointing toward us. I rested my paddle across my knees and kept my eyes on that V. I am not a brave man by nature, but at that moment I did not feel fear in the way that paralyzes. I felt a thread pulled tight inside me that said we had stepped into a place where the rules of the larger river did not hold, and that everything we did from that point forward would carry weight. Ramos raised his musket and kept it leveled at the center of the V. Duarte did not tell him to lower it. The patch of dark water held steady. The air around us felt stale. Sweat ran into my eyes and stung. I wiped it away with the back of my wrist and did not look down. I heard a faint rasp from under the hull, not wood on wood, not stone on wood, but the slow rub of something hard that flexed. The canoe leaned a fraction and settled. In the other boat, Davi crouched and gripped the gunwale. Irapua spoke to him in a low voice and shifted his weight to balance them. The V moved. It widened and then split, each arm sliding apart. I saw a line appear under the surface that tracked between them like the ridge of a moving back. The line passed under us in silence. Ramos twisted to follow it. "There," he said. "There." He wanted a command. No one gave it. The line faded and left only clear water. We took slow strokes along the reeds. The lake looked flat again. A turtle lifted its head near the scum margin and sank without a ripple. I wanted to believe we had imagined the pattern. I could not make myself believe it. I watched the reeds. Every few breaths, a narrow channel opened inside the mass and closed again. It made no sound. At the mouth of a small inlet, we found a shelf of pale sand with marks on it. The marks were from a heavy body that had rolled once and then slid back into the water. The print of that roll had pressed palm-sized scales into the sand, each edge sharp. I stepped out and sank to my ankles. The heat of the sand surprised me after hours on the black water. I crouched and laid my hand against one scale mark. My fingers did not reach across it. Ramos came up beside me and planted the butt of his musket in the sand. He looked at the marks and swallowed. "I will load again," he said, though his gun was already primed. He needed to say something. Duarte did not step onto the sand. He stood in the canoe and checked the line of the shore. He spoke without looking at the marks. "We continue along the arc and return by the far bank. Short stops only. No waiting, no waste of powder." He had moved into the part of himself that held to plan when events pushed against it. I had seen him enter that state when storms held us for days on a larger river. It did not always serve him well. We edged back into the lake. The sun slid toward the canopy. The light took on a dull cast that made distances hard to judge. In the stern, Father Celestino counted under his breath and touched his cross to the gunwale with each 10th count. He had a small habit for each kind of unease. I had not seen this one before. When he saw me notice, he nodded once and stopped the counting, but he did not let go of the cross. The first strike came without warning. The water bulged near the other canoe and a length of dark body rose and slammed down across their bow. The impact drove the forward half under and threw spray into the air. Davi cried out once and vanished between the arms of the reeds. Irapua held to the gunwale with one hand and swung his paddle with the other. The blade hit flesh with a flat crack. The length across the bow flexed and slid off, leaving deep gouges in the wood. The boat rocked hard and took in water. Ramos fired at the same instant, muzzle aimed where the body had vanished. The shot struck and the water foamed, but the bullet's path died in the black. The smell of powder mixed with the musk. My ears rang. "Davi," I called before I could stop myself. The reeds moved in two places, slow and deliberate. Irapua did not look at us. He plunged his arm into the reeds and dragged his cousin up by the shoulder straps. The boy coughed and clung to the thwart. Blood ran from a cut on his cheek. He stared at the water and said nothing. His face had the look of someone who had come up from a depth too fast. I counted his breaths without knowing why. They steadied after a while. We bailed with gourds. The other canoe shed water in a slow trickle from the split seams. Duarte pointed us toward a hummock no larger than a room, ringed with roots and drift. "There," he said. "We patch." No one argued. We moved with short, even strokes, keeping the paddles out of the deep sweep that had passed. The whole lake seemed to wait. On the hummock, we lifted the damaged bow into the fork of a root and packed fibers into the gouges. I melted resin with a flame and spread it with the back of a spoon. The resin set in thick bands that held the fibers in place. My hands shook and I breathed out through my nose to steady them. Ramos stood with his musket half-cocked and watched the water. His jaw worked. Irapua leaned over Davi and checked his arms and legs for breaks. The boy pushed his hand away and sat up. He still had not spoken. Father Celestino soaked a cloth and wiped the blood from the cut. "You are alive," he said. "You remain so by staying close." He did not offer more than that. The surface around the hummock broke in 3 places at once. Each rise showed only the top line of a body, no head, no tail. The arcs moved in slow, even circles that tightened with each pass. They did not splash. They pressed the water aside and let it settle behind them. Duarte gripped the hull and stared at the circles. He did not call a course. I felt a heat in my chest that had nothing to do with the air. I heard my own breath and the quick shuffle of Ramos's boots on the route. "Back in," I said, and surprised myself by speaking first. "We cannot wait for full dark." Duarte blinked, as if he had forgotten I was there. He nodded once. "Go," he said. "We keep close." No gaps. The resin had said enough to hold. We pushed the canoe down, slid it into the water, and loaded fast. Davy took the middle without protest. I gave him my gourd. He held it and did not use it. We aimed for the far bank where the drowned trunks rose out of the water. The circles followed. I counted 3, then a 4th that held back and then closed the gap. The strokes needed to be steady to keep the bows aligned, but my muscles wanted quick bursts. I kept the rhythm anyway. The first trunk we passed held the hacked remains of a small altar. Twigs bound with new grass hung from it. A clay dish balanced in a split near the top. It held a paste that had dried and cracked. The smell was sharp and clean, unlike the musk. It cut through the taste in my mouth. Father crossed himself and reached toward the dish. Irapua slapped his hand away. "Do not touch," he said. "Not yours." His voice had no weight of anger. It was flat, as if every extra word cost breath he could not spare. The water deepened under the trunks. The hull scraped something that was not wood. The canoe lifted and settled as if nudged from below. Duarte raised his paddle as if to strike and then lowered it. "Hold line," he said. "Do not strike unless it rises." He wanted to save energy for a clear shot. It was sound advice. It did not comfort me. A broad head broke the surface 2 canoe lengths ahead. It did not rise high. It showed the top line of the skull and the line of the eyes, which were set wide. The skin was dark and thick, with old scars that ran in straight channels. The head moved from side to side with no hurry. The mouth did not open. A low breath came out through the nostrils and spread across the water in a thin cloud that smelled of rotted leaves and fish oil. Ramos fired. The ball struck the head above the right eye and flattened without breaking the skin. The animal slid under. The ripples reached us and tapped the hulls like a hand. I felt a cold heaviness in my gut and thought of the capybara with the crushed ribs. We paddled harder. The circles tightened. A body rose under our stern and lifted us half a hand out of the water. The hull slithered over it and dropped. The shock ran through my teeth. Davy grabbed the gunwale and held it as if the wood could deliver him from the lake. He was not praying. He had moved past speech. The sun hit the top of the canopy and threw bars of light across the open water. In that light I saw a shape move that I had not seen before. It was not one body. It was 2, moving in line, the second following the path of the first with a slight lag. The lengths were equal. The second held back when the first rose. When the first slid under our bow, the second cut behind our stern. The pattern repeated. They were working to divide us without touching the hulls. I did not know if that was habit or intent. I only knew it kept our paddles off balance and pushed us toward the deeper middle. "Sure," I said. "Pick a point, and do not vary." Duarte fixed his eyes on a gap between trunks where a wedge of mud broke the line of the bank. "There," he said, and for once his choice matched mine. We drove hard. My shoulders burned. I heard the scrape against the other canoe again, and then a sharp crack as a thwart broke. The bow dipped and the water came in fast. I swung us around and put our stern against their beam. Ramos tossed his musket into our boat and climbed across without waiting for permission. The lighter hull rose. The damaged canoe settled to the gunwales. The guide and the boy stayed with it. They did not try to climb across. Irapua shoved the empty canoe toward the closest trunk to wedge it there. It stuck for a breath and then slid free and drifted. He did not watch it go. He put both hands on our gunwale and pushed to keep our bows aligned. He had decided to keep formation or die keeping it. The head rose again off our port bow. Closer this time. I saw the lid of the left eye close and open. The skin there looked milky. The animal had old damage in that eye. I raised my paddle and brought it down on the line where head met body. The blow did nothing. The head turned toward me and paused. In that pause I felt every part of my body prepare for the strike that did not come. Then it slid under with the same unhurried motion and left us rocking. We reached the wedge of mud and drove the bow into it. The hull stuck and held. We leaped into water to our knees and dragged the boat farther onto the shelf. The second hull bumped behind us and scraped onto the mud. The 2 long bodies passed in a line just beyond reach and turned out toward the center again. The water over their backs smoothed as if pressed by a plank. I stood with mud up to my shins and my hands on the bow line and tried to slow my breathing. I looked at the faces of the others. Sweat streaked the dust on Ramos's cheeks. Father's lips moved without sound. Duarte's eyes were fixed on the open water. Davy stared at the wedge of mud as if it were the only solid thing in the world. "We do not cross again today," I said. No one argued. The light had lowered to the point where the trunks threw long bands across the lake. Anything moving between them would be harder to track. We climbed the small bank above the mud and found a patch where we could string hammocks between 3 roots. We set no fire. Smoke would bring attention and give us comfort without safety. We ate cold bread and strips of meat with our hands. It tasted of nothing. I kept the rolled skin near my pack and checked the resin patch with my thumb. It had held. As night settled, the lake gave the breath sound again, at longer intervals and from farther off. One breath would come from near the center, and then, after a pause, another from the channel we had entered. The pattern repeated. It felt like a pair keeping a circuit. I lay in the hammock and counted the intervals. My mind tried to make meaning from the gaps. I stopped counting and listened to the small sounds of the others shifting and whispering. I did not sleep for a long time. When I slept, it was thin. Close to dawn, a new sound came. It was a dull knock against wood, repeated at measured gaps. I slid from the hammock and moved to the edge of the mud. In the dim light, I saw our empty canoe bump against a trunk and drift and then bump again. It had come back from wherever the water had carried it. It turned slowly until the gouged bow faced us. The resin patch looked pale against the dark wood. The boat rocked once more and came to rest against the mud at my feet. I could not decide if the return was chance or a gift. I only knew it was here. I pulled it up with both hands and felt the weight of wet wood and silt. Behind me, I heard Duarte drop from his hammock. He came to the edge and looked without speaking. "We repair fully," he said. "We plan a crossing in daylight. We make an end of this, or we do not leave." He had given up the circuit and moved to a different kind of resolve. I did not call it courage, and I did not call it despair. It was a single line he had set for himself when other lines failed. I wrapped the bowline twice around a root and tied it off. Then I turned to the others and began to divide the tasks for the morning. The air before dawn hung thick and still. We gathered what little dry fiber we could find beneath the roots and scraped resin from the seams of old branches. My hands ached from pulling at knots and stripping bark, but I did not let myself slow. The others worked without much speech. The boy stayed crouched by the bow line, as if touching the wood anchored him. Father Celestino murmured a prayer under his breath while warming a strip of resin with an ember held between 2 stones. Ramos cleaned his musket and checked the powder horn 3 times, though he had fired only once. His eyes kept straying to the water. Duarte drew in the mud with a stick, marking paths from our spit back to the tributary. He did not look at the lines after he scratched them. He only set them down as if the act itself steadied him. By the time the sun reached the top of the canopy, the patched canoe held shape again. The resin bands glistened where the morning heat had softened them and then set. We tested the hull in shallow water, rocking it from side to side. It groaned but did not open. The sound carried farther than I liked. Every ripple seemed loud against the still lake. I glanced at the reeds, half expecting them to part. Nothing moved. We ate a thin meal of farina mixed with water. No one wanted meat. Afterward, Duarte gathered us near the bow. His face looked drawn, the lines deeper than the day before. He spoke plainly. "We cannot circle the lake. We cannot wait on this spit until the water rises. We cross the open and follow the far channel. Once we reach running water, the current will carry us. We stay close. No separation. No shots unless the body rises against the hull. If we are divided, we do not return for each other. Understand?" He looked at each of us in turn. No one argued. Even Ramos, who had always spoken against caution, nodded without word. We shoved the canoes into the water and climbed in. The surface felt wrong from the first stroke. The paddles cut with no sound, as if the black swallowed the movement. Our reflections blurred and bent under us. The air smelled of musk again.